At the moment, we're still using our user subject in our application. And let me simply comment this out so that we get errors that point us at the files which we now have to update to use our NGRX store instead. This is a nice trick to find all the places we now have to update. And that starts with the auth intersetter. In the auth intersetter, we're using the auth service and we're accessing our user. Now that is a good example for a place where we now want to use our NGRX store. So in there, let's inject our store of type store. As before, store needs to be imported from ngrx/store. And it still is a generic type, so again, we should import everything as from app from our root store folder and there from the app reducer file. And then here the type will be from app state, describing how our state looks like in this application. Now here, where I refer to this auth service user, now we can instead just use this store select auth. And now, of course, I'm interested in getting my user out of that part of the global state. I don't want to take the entire auth state. This is an object with a user property. I'm just interested in the value of that user property. So in that concrete user we have here. Good thing is, select gives us an observable, so we can call pipe. And I only want to get one snapshot here, so take one still is correct. I want to have that here. But now we'll add an extra step before we continue with the user, because right now what we get here is not the user. Instead, it's an object with a user property. That's a difference though. So we'll add the map operator here, which you therefore have to import from RxJS operators. And with the map operator added, what we get here is our auth state in the end. So here, my goal then is to map this auth state into something new. Now this auth state here will have a user property, so I can access auth state user. And the IDE and TypeScript understand this automatically because I'm selecting the auth slice here, and I define in my app state setup, if we have a look at that app reducer real quick, I define that the app state has a shopping list and an auth part, and the auth part has the from auth state interface or structure. And therefore, this in turn comes from the auth reducer. It's this interface. And this all comes together in the auth intersetter, where I do select my auth slice here, and therefore, well, TypeScript is able to resolve which kind of data I'm getting here. I'm getting my auth state. Here I can then access the user property, and therefore this is now mapped into a new observable, which then reaches my next step, which takes just that user that's inside of that observable. So now this should work fine, actually. With that, we have two more errors in the auth guard and in the header component. Let's move on to the auth guard first. Here again, I'm using my auth service user, and just as before, we can simply fix that by injecting the store here instead. Type store, again imported from @ngrx store, and again we need to import the description or the interface describing our app state. So import everything as from app from our root store app reducer. And then here, the generic type, when we inject store, is from app state. Again, this gives us the advantage that we're now able to use this store, select auth here. And again, we pipe. Don't know why it's coloring this in such a strange way, but this is the same code as before. We now pipe take one, which is good. But now, before mapping the user, well, actually what we get is not the user, but the auth state. So we need another map operator where we now get our auth state, and what we return here is auth state.user. And now this gets wrapped into a new observable, which then can be handled as before in here. And with that, let's move on to the header component. There, I'm also interested in my auth service and in my user. I subscribe to changes in my user, and therefore we should do the same here. Now by injecting the store, just as before, imported from @ngrx store, and also just as before, now we should import our app state from the app reducer in the store folder so that we can assign this type here and get good auto completion and TypeScript support. And then here, we're not using this auth service user, but instead this store select auth. Then here I'm subscribing and I get my user. Again, this is not how it works. What select auth gives us is instead not our user, but it's an object where we have a user property. Hence, we can simply add pipe, add the map operator, which you need to import from RxJS operators. And with that added here, we can use that auth state. And now I'm using a quick inline statement because we only have one expression, which we instantly return. So here, this does exactly the same as we did before in the auth intersetter and the auth guard. I'm getting my auth state, I'm pulling out the user, and I'm returning that here in the map operator so that the next step in line really gets an observable that resolves to a user. And now all these parts should be fixed. It compiles fine. Let's see if it works as expected. Well, auto login seems to work. Let's see if we can fetch data and therefore if our intersetter works. That all seems to work. Let's fetch again. Yep. And logging out also works and the header is also updated correctly. Logging in is also looking good. So this all seems to work, and now we're managing this main authentication flow with NGRX as well. Before we tackle side effects and how we handle such effects with NGRX, two important things. First, let's have a look at our reducer real quick, and there at this default return state case. Thus far I mentioned that this is important for initializing the state. And that is true. When NGRX starts up, thanks to us initializing the store module in the app module, it essentially sends one initial action to all reducers. And since this action has an identifier we don't handle anywhere here, and we'll soon see which identifier this is, no worries. Since this is an identifier we don't explicitly handle, we make it into the default case, therefore we return the state. And since we have no prior state when this first action is emitted, we therefore take this initial state. So that's one important note. But another thing about what I just said is also important. This initial action, dispatched automatically, reaches all reducers. Well, that is not just the case for the initial action. Any action you dispatch, even your own ones, not just that initial one. So any action you dispatch by calling dispatch always reaches all reducers. It does not just reach the auth reducer because you're dispatching it in the auth service. How would NGRX know that this is your intention? It would be dangerous if that would be the result, because that means you could never reach another reducer with actions dispatched here in the auth service. And there certainly are scenarios where you might want to reach another reducer. So therefore, any action you dispatch always reaches all reducers. This has an important implication. It's even more important that you always copy the old state here, and it's super important that you return this default state here, so the unchanged state, because if a shopping list related action is dispatched, it still reaches the auth reducer. In there, of course, we have no case that would handle that action, hence all these code snippets here don't kick in, but therefore the default case kicks in and handles this. And there we absolutely have to return our current state, otherwise we would lose that or cause an error. And I can simply show that by adding a console log here, where I just print the state so that we can see what's inside there. And now let's go back to the application. Let's wait for it to reload. And please note, I added console log in the auth reducer. Now let me do something related to the shopping list. Clear my console first, then I delete. You see, I get my user printed here from the auth reducer. But what we see here is that this is our auth state slice. Now this does not contain any information about the shopping list because the state slices, so these state objects, are managed on a per global state slice level. So the auth reducer is only caring about its state, which has a user property. The shopping list reducer only cares about its state. But actions reach all reducers, and therefore it is important that we return our default state for this state slice here. Otherwise, if we wouldn't do that, if we would return null here or anything like that, we would basically drop our state here in the auth reducer when something is dispatched in another part of the app. So that's the first important thing. The next important thing is that since our dispatched actions reach all reducers, you really have to ensure that your identifiers here are logged in across the entire application, because these auth-related actions here are not just handled by the auth reducer, they also reach the shopping list reducer. Now, of course, we in this application, we have identifiers that don't really interfere. Add ingredient and login are quite different. But for bigger applications, it is of course possible that you have duplicate identifiers across different parts of your app. Now, since they have to be unique for the entire application, because actions reach the entire application, I would recommend a technique called prefixing. That means you added your identifiers here a little bit to have one extra piece of information that really makes them unique. In NGRX world, you typically use square brackets, and then you add the name of the feature you're dealing with. So in this case, that would be shopping list. And then you could still use the uppercase notation here, or you also use a normal text casing here, so to say. Now, I will convert it like this. It's not a must do, but it is recommended, especially for bigger apps, to avoid clashes. Now, of course, any prefix that ensures uniqueness would be fine, but here I'll just implement a pattern you'll also find in the official NGRX docs. So here I'll always use the feature name in square brackets first, and then basically a plain English description of what it does. So let's quickly do that for all these actions here. It's especially interesting here for start and stop edit, because we could probably imagine that we have different parts in the app where we also start and stop editing. So that's my shopping list, actions file updated. And now let's also be consistent and do the same for the auth actions, even though it's very unlikely that we use login and log out anywhere else in the app, but still doesn't hurt. You don't need to change your constant name, so that stays uppercase login and uppercase logout. It's really just about the values you store inside of these constants. And with that, we now enhance this a little bit more. Now let's focus on these side effects.